Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things and welcome to another video. And today I'm going to be doing my April reading wrap up and talking about all the things that I read in the month of April. So I had another pretty big, pretty intense reading month in April. I read 20 books, which is a lot of books, and because I was on holiday for quite a lot of April, only 2 of those were unpublished books that I read for work. So if you don't know, I work in publishing, so I have to do quite a bit of reading of unpublished stuff for work, but I only actually read 2 unpublished things in the month of April, which means I have 18 books to talk to you about today, which means it is going to be a long one, so maybe grab yourself a cup of tea and we'll have a chat about books. So I will start off as I usually do with classics, although April was a fairly contemporary month for me. But I did read one Victorian novel this month, and that was Miss Mackenzie by Anthony Trollope, and this was the book I read for my Trollope project, which I'm doing this year, where I try to read a novel by Anthony Trollope every month. This is an interesting novel of his. It is a standalone novel, and it follows a woman called Miss Mackenzie. She's in her mid-30s when her brother dies and leaves her a fortune, and she has never had any money before, and she's never had much of a life and many prospects. She has basically spent her life nursing her invalid brother and staying inside and not really speaking to very many people, and suddenly she finds herself a wealthy heiress in society with a lot of men suddenly wanting to marry her after no one had really shown much interest in doing so before. And it basically follows her and the various suitors around her and is really good fun. One of my favourite things about Anthony Trollope is the fact that his books are often quite unique and quite different, and a lot of his novels don't follow a lot of Victorian conventions. It is not very common for a Victorian novel to take as its heroine a woman in her mid-30s, and that was nice. This is also just a really kind of tender and pleasant read as well. And another thing I enjoyed is that there is a little cameo of some of the characters from Anthony Trollope's Palliser series in here, which is quite fun too. Moving on into the 20th century, I read an Agatha Christie novel this month, and that was The Secret Adversary, which was her second novel and is the first in the Tommy and Tuppence series, which I really enjoyed. I haven't read any Tommy and Tuppence novels before, and obviously Agatha Christie is much more famous for Poirot and Miss Marple, but actually I really enjoyed this one. I find it quite interesting reading Agatha Christie's early work in comparison to her later work, because her later work feels more like what I associate with Agatha Christie, whereas her early novels are much more like Sherlock Holmes-esque. Like The Secret Adversary does have mysteries in it, but it's not a murder mystery like a lot of her later books are. It is much more of a kind of adventure mystery in the way that quite a lot of Sherlock Holmes stories are, and it is a bit weird and surreal, but in a kind of fun way. And it basically looks at these 2 young people, Tommy and Tuppence, who are both sort of in their early 20s. Tuppence is a young woman and Tommy is a young man. That's more obvious. This is just after the First World War. Neither of them have very much money, and they decide they're going to try and like seek out adventure together to see if that is a potential way for them to make money, except that of course they then get involved in things way above their head, and everything goes a little bit crazy, but in a very fun Agatha Christie-esque but also slightly Sherlock Holmes-esque way. This was really fun. I really enjoyed it. I basically listened to the entire audiobook in more or less 1 or 2 sittings on a plane, and yeah, it was just a really thoroughly enjoyable read. And then I also read Ray Bradbury's Dandelion Wine. This is a novel of his from the 1950s, and it's set in interwar America in Illinois. And it follows a young boy called Douglas and his brother Tom, and it's kind of a coming-of-age novel, I suppose. Ray Bradbury said that it was like semi-autobiographical and based on his own childhood and the town in which he grew up, and it looks really interestingly at kind of growing up and childhood in small-town America. The book kind of begins with Douglas having this sudden realisation that he is alive, and it follows this summer of his life in which he kind of becomes a little bit older, grows up, becomes more aware of his surroundings, becomes aware in a way that he is alive, and also becomes more aware of death as people around him die. And it's a really interesting novel. It's quite episodical, I would say. It reminded me quite a lot of the first half of To Kill a Mockingbird before the like main plot of To Kill a Mockingbird kicks off. There's a lot of like interaction between various characters and exploration of this small town and all the various different figures in it, which I really enjoyed. Interestingly, because I knew it was like a part autobiographical novel, I thought it would follow Douglas, who is, I suppose, Ray Bradbury, all the way through, but actually there are a lot of chapters which are kind of like vignettes about other people in the town, which I really enjoyed. And I think my favourite one was about this elderly woman and this man in his 20s who form this like really strong connection and are both kind of aware that like if they'd been born at different times they could have like got married and had a really nice life together, but they're the wrong ages, which was just a really odd story but quite like bittersweet and nicely done. There's a lot of like odd small vignettes in here which are really powerfully done, and yeah, it was just a really enjoyable read. Moving forward still in time, I read a book from the 1980s. This is A Brother of the More Famous Jack by Barbara Trapido, which I have to say I didn't really like very much. So I've read one other novel by Barbara Trapido before, Sex and Stravinsky, which I read for a book club a few years ago and really enjoyed. But that book is her most recent book from like 2010, I think, and this is her first novel from the early 1980s. And I found it just not a very enjoyable read. The quote on the front says that it is a kind of bohemian Brideshead Revisited, which I certainly see. It is about a young woman who ends up sort of becoming connected to this family. The father is her lecturer at university, and she ends up kind of having a relationship with the son. And basically, as this young woman falls in love with the son, she kind of falls in love with the whole family in a kind of Brideshead Revisited, Child Rider-esque way, which I enjoyed, and from the beginning I thought I might like it. However, the book as a whole didn't grip me very well, and I also found it very, very dated. I don't know, I made a video last October, I think, about like problematic aspects when reading classics, and how when I read a book from the 19th century, if there are lots of things in it that I find problematic and there's lots of things that I find sexist or that offend me slightly as a modern reader, I don't mind because it's a historical source to me as well as a novel, and I appreciate it's from a very different time and that this is a different context. And I find that really easy to do and an easy way of thinking when I'm reading books from the 19th century, even from the first half of the 20th century. But when I'm reading books from the 80s, I find it much harder, and I have to keep reminding myself that actually the early 1980s is quite a long time ago, and the way different people thought of things was quite different. But actually, like, the way people in this book talk about women, and the way, like, even the men who are supposed to be nice talk about women, just I found so frustrating and so annoying that I found it really hard to enjoy, and I kept having to remind myself there's a different social context, it was written a long time ago. But when it's like 40 years ago rather than 100 years ago or 150 years ago, I find it much harder to get into that mindset, which was part of the reason I think why I didn't enjoy it. But also I just found it quite boring and didn't really get into it, and I enjoyed her writing style much less than I did in Sex and Stravinsky, which is a much more modern novel, and I think it's partly just because these are two very different books written by the same person but 30 years apart. So yeah, not one I love. But moving on to contemporary fiction, I certainly read a lot of that this month. This is a Japanese novel called Slow Boat by Hideo Fukawa, which I enjoyed. It was weird, but in a way that I quite liked, and it is basically about this young man who is looking back on the course of his life, specifically on the kind of three girls/women who have been important to him in his childhood and his adulthood, his three girlfriends, and how he has grown up in Tokyo, never ever left the city, and has tried like 3 times to leave Tokyo, and kind of failed for one reason or the other, which is all kind of tied in with these 3 girlfriends, and he kind of wants to make one final attempt to leave Tokyo. It's a bit surreal in places and a bit weird, but I really enjoyed it because the narrative style is really fun, and though it is a bit odd, it's also just quite an enjoyable read. I'm really enjoying reading my way through Pushkin Press's Japanese novella series. I still think my favourite by quite a long way is Miss Ice Sandwich, but this was a really enjoyable read as well. This is Slade House by David Mitchell, which I finally read. This has been on my TBR for quite a while, by which I mean this is the Foyles special edition, which I got signed by David Mitchell when I worked in Foyles, and I haven't worked in Foyles for more than 3.5 years. However, I finally got round to reading this, and I quite enjoyed it. It's not my favourite David Mitchell. I think of the 3 David Mitchells I've read, this may be my least favourite so far. Cloud Atlas is still definitely a very long way above both this and The Bone Clocks. More than the other things I've read by David Mitchell, which I would describe more as like sci-fi, sort of, literary sci-fi. This is quite strongly a horror novel, and horror is not really the kind of thing I read. Oh, and I did actually quite enjoy it, but I think it was less for me than something like Cloud Atlas is. This also has like some links to The Bone Clocks. There was one character who I recognised, that was quite fun as well. And basically this looks at this place called Slade House, which appears sometimes but isn't always there, and various people who get lured to Slade House and then kind of have their souls eaten, as happens when you're in a David Mitchell novel. In many ways, I really enjoyed this. I think David Mitchell writes brilliantly, and he's very, very good at narrative voice. Each of the 6 chapters in this is narrated by a different character, and all of those characters feel really fully fledged, and the voice is so well done, which, you know, for 6 narrators in a book that's not that long is really, really impressive, and that's one of the things I love about David Mitchell's work. However, I found it a little bit repetitive, and I think that's because similar things happen in quite a lot of the narrator's stories as they kind of move forward in time and revisit Slade House from the perspective of different people, which meant it became a little bit repetitive in the second half. But moreover, I think horror is less for me than other stuff that you get in other David Mitchell novels. So, like I said, I still really love David Mitchell's writing style a lot. I've got The Thousand Autumns of Jacob de Zoat on my shelf, which I'm really looking forward to reading, and Nick has read that one and says that I will really like it, but I think Slade House was just slightly less for me than some of the rest of his work. Then I also read Call Me By Your Name by Andre Ackerman, which I listened to on audiobook. I had been meaning vaguely to read Call Me By Your Name for ages, especially because of the recommendation of Rachel from Rachel's Reading Corner, and I know how much she loved this book. And I saw that it was on audiobook on Overdrive from my library, so I decided to listen to it. And I have quite mixed feelings. To explain what Call Me By Your Name is about, it basically follows a young man who's about 17, 18, in Italy for the summer with his family, and then a young man comes to stay with them called Oliver, who's in his mid-20s, and our narrator falls desperately in love with Oliver. Kind of a thin line between love and obsession, and it's about kind of their relationship growing and our main character kind of discovering his sexuality. I had quite mixed feelings on this. Logistically and objectively, looking at it as a novel, I think it has a lot of problems. The beginning is really messy and confusing quite a lot, and the pacing is quite poor and slightly oddly done. A lot of the characters are underdeveloped, like a lot of the minor characters, such as the young girl who lived next door who's not well. Like, she was really interesting, but she's barely in it, and she's really underdeveloped. And like, both of the two main characters, one of them is like 17, 18, I think the other's 26. Neither of them read like their ages. The 26-year-old reads younger, the 18-year-old reads older. It's really introspective and like obsessive, and some of the writing is like overly flowery and over the top. Yet at the same time, I kind of loved it, and it was kind of amazing. Because at its heart, it is really a beautiful story about first love and coming of age, and it's really powerful. There are so many like really important moving scenes in it, and it is written wonderfully, over the toply, but in a way that kind of works, because that, I suppose, is the only way in which our narrator does feel like a teenager, because everything is so like melodramatic, but in a way that you kind of believe that that's how he feels. And although I think, like, the editor in me thinks there is a lot of problems with this book, but the reader in me is like, oh, but it was also kind of wonderful, wasn't it? Then I also finally got round to reading Sally Rooney's Normal People, which is one that I've heard a lot about on BookTube. This follows two people, Marianne and Connell, from their teenage years into their early 20s, and when they're at school, Marianne is really unpopular and Connell is quite popular, and they kind of have a friendship that develops into more, but they don't quite manage to make it work because of their like different school situations. They end up going to university together, where they kind of continue to have this sort of on-off friendship relationship, and it basically looks at their lives, and it's a kind of sort of coming of age story. I actually enjoyed this much more than I thought I would. I think because of the way it had been hyped, I had in my head that I might not have liked it, whereas actually I did quite enjoy it. I found the writing really readable and enjoyable. It was a very fun book to read, I suppose, in many ways. I read it in sort of, you know, a few hours in one sitting. The one thing I would say was that I found the ending a little bit abrupt and a little bit disappointing. I felt like the story didn't really end, and I was expecting it, from the way I'd heard people talk about it, to follow them for a lot more of their lives, and actually it just follows them for a few years. They're still in their early 20s when the book ends, and I thought we were going to follow them through a lot more of their life. So I did enjoy it, but I felt like the ending just came at a random point, and that the story could have carried on quite a lot longer, and in a way I wanted it to follow them through more of their lives. So I did enjoy it, but the ending was a little bit of a letdown for me. But then, this month I also read Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid, which has had a lot of hype, but worthy hype. Hype that deserved to be there. This is a fantastic, fantastic book, and I read it on audiobook, and I would highly, highly recommend the audiobook. So Taylor Jenkins Reid is a wonderful author. I read Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo earlier this year, and that is another of my favourite books of the year so far. So is Daisy Jones and the Six. This book is set up in transcript form, pretending to be transcripts of interviews with various band members from this mythically famous band called Daisy Jones and the Six. And basically, through the perspective of various people in the band and various people around them, we follow Daisy Jones, the singer, and this band called the Six, and how they kind of rise to fame and find each other. And it looks at kind of the rock and roll scene in 70s America, and it looks at complexities of family and growing up and music and love and relationships and friendship and the power of music and the connection that music can bring. And basically it follows the relationship between Daisy Jones and the lead singer of the Six, a man called Billy, who sort of hate each other but also are really similar and have a lot in common and a lot of connection between them. And it's just fantastic. It is a book about basically sex, drugs and rock and roll. Mostly drugs and rock and roll. There's a lot of drugs in this book. But what I loved about this book, and what I love about Taylor Jenkins Reid as a writer in general is that her characterization is superb, and her writing of love and the complexities of love and of friendship and of human relationships in general is brilliant. Few writers are that skilled in writing about human relationships as Taylor Jenkins Reid is. Like, she is absolutely, absolutely superb. Her writing is beautiful, her characterization, her voices are so good, and the way she examines the relationships between people is just nearly unmatchable. She's very, very, very talented, and I loved Daisy Jones and the Six a lot. It's also, like, the way she writes that music in this book is incredible. I have never in my life been so frustrated that I cannot listen to songs, because it talks about these songs and their impact and their lyrics and how people love them, and you just can't believe that these aren't real songs, in the same way that you can't believe the characters aren't real people. Like, it feels like this band really exists and that their songs really exist, and you get caught up in it. I loved it a lot. An awful lot. It would definitely be one of my favourite books of the year. And I would also highly, highly recommend the audiobook, which is fantastic. I genuinely think this may be one of the best audiobooks I've ever listened to in terms of the production quality and the acting. Because this book is set up as transcripts and people telling their story, the way the audiobook works is it is a full cast production. Every single character has an actor who is playing them, and when they read out the dialogue that is in the book, they act it brilliantly. It's very heavily acted, more so than some audiobooks are, and it's just amazing. Like, the audiobook is so good and so immersive and so thoroughly well done and feels like a radio documentary in some ways, and I would highly, highly recommend the audiobook. Like, the book is fantastic as a whole, but I would really recommend listening to it because it's a book that lends itself brilliantly to audiobook, and the audiobook is so, so well done. Now I have quite a lot of historical fiction to tell you about. First, I have 3 books that I read for the Walter Scott Prize, because they were on the Walter Scott Prize long list. I did a individual, like, Walter Scott Prize review roundup reviewing these 3 books, so I won't talk about them in too much detail, but one I read was The Long Take by Robin Robertson. I really can't believe I read this in April. It feels like I read it a very long time ago. This is a novel in verse set in 1940s and 1950s America, following a Canadian man who fought in the Second World War and now is discharged, and he becomes a journalist and starts writing about homelessness and how it especially affects ex-soldiers. It's a really, really interesting novel that looks at a lot of really interesting themes and a lot of really interesting social issues after the Second World War. And it also is written in verse, which I thought I wasn't going to like, but actually I think was quite effective, and it's just a really interesting novel. But I also read After the Party by Cressida Connolly, and all of these are out from the library, which is why I don't have them here to show you now. After the Party was one I really liked the first half of, and then didn't like the second half of so much. It's set in 1939, and it follows a woman who has come back to England after several years abroad, and through her sisters, she ends up getting involved in a particular organisation. I explain what the group she gets involved with is in the other video, because I didn't feel like I could properly review it without talking about it, but I don't think I will here, because I think it's like a semi-spoiler, but not like a huge spoiler, but like a halfway point spoiler. I don't know. You don't realise for a while what the group she has got involved in is, but it ends up getting quite dark in many ways. However, one of the reasons why I didn't love this book is because I didn't feel like the darkness and the dark aspects of this book and the particular themes being dealt with were really explored, which I think was kind of the point, but I also therefore felt it didn't work that well. So the writing was really good, but I didn't really feel the book pulled through and delivered on some of the interesting issues that it was dealing with. I then also read All the Lives We Never Lived by Anuradha Roy, which I really liked. This is probably actually my favourite book on the Walter Scott long list, though sadly it didn't make the shortlist, which The Long Take and After the Party both did. All the Lives We Never Lived is set in India in the 1930s and forwards, and basically is a man looking back on his childhood and his relationship with his mother, who left when he was quite young. And it's about him kind of in later life learning more about his mother and reevaluating his past and their relationship and what his future might have been if his past had been different. It really interestingly looks at India and the kind of growing Indian independence movement, and it also looks at the position of women in India in the 1930s. It's just a really, really interesting novel, really powerful, really moving, and really, really, really well done. Like, I'm really sad that it didn't make the shortlist, especially because one of the other books that made the shortlist, Warlight by Michael Andarte, is another book that is about a man looking back on his younger years and evaluating his relationship with his mother, who left when he was quite young. And it's so much less good than All the Lives We Never Lived, and it's so much less powerful and less moving than All the Lives We Never Lived. But I will make my peace with that, and in the meantime you should all go read All the Lives We Never Lived by Anuradha Roy, because it's a really, really brilliant novel. Still on the historical fiction, this month I also read The Mermaid and Mrs. Hancock by Imogen Hermes Gower. This was a novel that I really enjoyed, though I didn't I didn't think it was perfect, but I did really like it. This is one I've been meaning to read for ages. I've heard a lot of great things about it on BookTube, especially from Marissa over at Blatantly Bookish. And I'd heard it compared to The Crimson Petal and the White a lot. So I went in quite cautiously because I really don't like The Crimson Petal and the White, but it is nothing like The Crimson Petal and the White. This is set in Georgian London. It follows a man called Mr. Hancock, who is a merchant, and one day his manager and the captain of his ships comes back to say that he has sold Mr. Hancock's ship, but with it he has bought a mermaid and produces a rather ugly looking specimen, which Mr. Hancock doesn't really know what to do with and decides that he may as well exhibit. And this kind of brings him into a new world that he hasn't been in before. And at the same time, we also follow a woman called Angelica Neal. Angelica has been the mistress of a duke for several years, and he has recently passed away, and now she needs to make her way in the world herself in a different fashion, and we follow her as well. I really enjoyed this book. I think the writing is brilliant. The historical detail, the atmosphere and the setting were all done really, really brilliantly, and I'm really looking forward to reading what Imogen Hermes-Gower writes in the future. I also think the characterization and the character relationships were done really, really well here. I listened to this on audiobook, and the audiobook was really strong, and I just thought overall it was a really well told, really interesting book. The only thing I will say is that I think I preferred the first 3 quarters to the last quarter, partly because, to be honest, I could have done with less mermaids. I could have done with less mermaid stuff. I think you could have taken out the mermaids in this book and all of the mermaid references in this book and put something else in or nothing in, and it would have still been a brilliant book, as long as you found a way to fix the plot significance of the mermaid at the beginning. All of the mermaid related plot in the second half of the book I felt was a little bit unnecessary, and I think that is just to do with my personal taste. I know I was talking to Marissa from Blatantly Bookish about this, and I think she saw a lot of significance to the mermaids that I didn't really get. I'll link her review video of this book down below for you to find out a bit more about that too. So I would say that although I really, really enjoyed this, I didn't think it was completely perfect. And I felt like the mermaid element was there as a hook, but actually that wasn't what was interesting about the book at all. Regardless of mermaids, I would highly, highly recommend this book. From not entirely perfect historical fiction to perfect historical fiction, I now have my 2 favourite books of the year so far. Joint, shall we say. One is The Wonder by Emma Donoghue, which I did an individual book review of, so I will link that down below. And this is an amazing book. I've read one book by Emma Donoghue before, Rome, which I really enjoyed, but not nearly so much as I enjoyed this. This is set in Victorian Ireland. This follows a woman called Liv. She is a nurse from England, and she is called over to Ireland to watch over a young girl, and this young girl, Anna, is claimed by her village to have not eaten or drunk anything for 4 months. Anna is obviously very sceptical about this, and she and another nurse are charged to take turns watching Anna to see whether or not Anna is actually living without food. And I really like a book that is set up so that there might be something supernatural going on, but you're not quite sure. I really enjoy that. The writing was brilliant. The exploration of the historical time was fantastic. The characterization was brilliant, and it was so moving and so pacey and had me on the edge of my seat the whole time, and it was so good. Just such a fantastic novel. Really, really, really my kind of historical fiction. So well done. I would highly, highly recommend it. It was so, so brilliant. I'll link my individual book review down below because I go into a lot more detail there. But basically, I was completely blown away by this book, and it was amazing, and I loved it an awful, awful lot. And I was like, this is my favourite book of the year so far. And then I read this, which is also jointly, let's say, my favourite book of the year so far. This is Once Upon a River by Diane Setterfield. So I made an individual author spotlight on Diane Setterfield this month, which I will link down below. Diane Setterfield is probably my favourite modern author, and her first novel, The 13th Tale, is my favourite contemporary book. And this is her 3rd book, which just came out in January, and it is absolutely brilliant. It is set upon the River Thames, and it begins in an inn with various characters from around the River Thames gathered together in this inn, which is known for its storytelling. And in the middle of a storytelling session, suddenly all the characters find themselves in the midst of a story themselves when a man crashes through the door carrying in his arms a dead child. The man is severely injured, the nurse is called, the child seems to all intents and purposes to be dead, except a few minutes later when she opens her eyes and suddenly is not dead after all. No one knows who this child is. The man, when he wakes up, who is injured, says it's not his child, he found her, and various people lay claim to this 4-year-old child who doesn't speak, saying that it is their child, but no one quite knows whose child it actually is. And the book basically follows various characters who live up and down the River Thames and how they're kind of linked together by this inn and this child. It's really, really, really fantastic. I mean, I love Diane Setterfield's writing. She writes beautifully. It's set in the Victorian period, and The way it looks at the history of that time is really, really wonderful. The way it looks at family and friendship and relationships and like motherhood and fatherhood and the draw children can have for particular adults, which actually The Wonder looks at too. This book looks at so many interesting themes so powerfully. It also looks a lot at death and loss and grief and just, it's just amazing. Like I really can't recommend it enough. It is a brilliant, brilliant story with such interesting themes, such good characterization and writing, and like a really pacey plot and lots of mysteries and twists all the way along. I loved it an awful, awful lot. And yeah, definitely one of my favourite books of the year so far. Moving away from novels, I also read a poetry collection this month. This is The Girl Aquarium by Jen Campbell, who you may know from YouTube. I'll link her channel down below. I really enjoyed this. I've read some of Jen's poetry before and some of her non-fiction and some of her short stories because she is very versatile and talented, but it was really nice to read a little bit more of her poetry. This is a really interesting collection. As you might expect from a Jen collection, there are fairy tale references and there are circus references and some really, really powerful emotive moments and really powerful images. I have to say, I think my favourite poems were The Day We Ran Away from the Circus, Hello Dark, Angel Metal, and The Angel of the North. I think The Angel of the North was my absolute favourite one, which I just really like. If you're from the UK, you will definitely be familiar with the Angel of the North statue, and it was just a really lovely poem. It was just a really nice and different and interesting way of looking at something familiar that lots of people know. So yeah, I would really highly recommend Jen's collection. It's really great. I then also read some short stories. This is Dip Flash by Jonathan Pinnock. Jonathan Pinnock is someone that I did a creative writing masters with a few years ago, so it was quite fun actually. There were quite a few stories in this collection that I had already read in slightly different forms in workshops on our masters, which was really fun. I think actually my favourite story in the whole collection is one that I originally read on our creative writing masters. I have to look up the title because I know its original title and not the title it actually has now. It's called Adagio Assay and is about two homeless people who break into various flats around London in order to like pretend that they are other people for a night. I know that sounds quite weird, but it's really powerful and really beautiful. But there are a lot of other stories in here that I love as well. Jonathan is one of those writers who writes a lot of quite weird and original fiction. There are a lot of stories in here that are very odd in the best kind of way. His writing is funny and dark throughout and really enjoyable, and this is a short story collection I would highly recommend. And the title Dip Flash as well refers, like his last short story collection, Dot Dash, to the format of having a long story and then a really short story, like just a page, which is a format I really enjoy. And then also read this. This is the London Short Story Prize Anthology 2018, which feels weird to be including in a wrap-up because I wrote one of the short stories in here, but I did read it this month, so I feel like I should also still discuss it. Basically, excitingly, last November, I was shortlisted for the London Short Story Prize, and after they longlist and shortlist people for the prize, they produce an anthology of all the longlisted short stories, which is really cool. So there are 10 stories in here. There was a launch event for the anthology towards the end of April, and everyone who is longlisted in this anthology came along and read a part of their short story. So I like listened to the first bit or an extract of everyone's short story and then went away and read all of the short stories, which I really enjoyed. There's some really fun stories in here. There are some very funny stories in here. There are some like powerfully poignant stories in here. There are some that are very much magic realist and some that are very realist. And yeah, in general, it's just a really enjoyable read. And then finally, I have one other book to talk about, and that is a book that I read for work, but one that is published so I can speak about on the internet, and that is this. This is Wild About the Girl by Louise Pentland. This is Louise Pentland's second book. I read the first one a month or two ago, and I will be working on the third one at work in the next few months, so I thought I would catch up on the series. Louise is a really funny and fun writer, and basically the series follows Robin Wilde, who is a single mother of a girl called Lila, who is sort of 7 or 8 across the two books, and it looks at her life, her relationships, her friendships, and her efforts to sort of balance working, being a mum, being a friend, sometimes being a girlfriend, and kind of everything in her life coming together. I really like this one. I think I might have even liked it more than the first one, and I'm very excited to be working on the third one soon. So that is the very long list of books that I read in the month of April. It was pretty busy, but I read a lot of fantastic books, and that's very exciting. So I think that's all for today. Please let me know down in the comments if you've read any of the books I spoke about today and if you liked them, especially if you enjoyed Daisy Jones and the Six, The Wonder, or Once Upon a River. Let me know, because those 3 books really made my month and were absolutely incredible, and I'm sure will be very high up on my favourite books at the end of the year when we get to that point many months hence. And I think that is pretty much all for today. Thank you so much for watching this very long video, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.